The morning Ada Wilcox found Louis Walker curled against her front door like a man who had made peace with the cold. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply stood in the gray pre-dawn light with her hand pressed to her mouth and her heart doing something she could not rightly explain. But that is not where this story begins. It begins 3 weeks earlier, on the kind of October afternoon in 1878 when the New Mexico Territory felt like the edge of everything. And Ada Wilcox was doing what she always did when the world pressed too hard against her chest. She was working. The town of Redrock Crossing sat in a shallow valley between two rust-colored bluffs, and it was the sort of place that the railroad companies had looked at and then politely ignored. That neglect had kept it small and kept it honest, mostly, though there were exceptions as there were exceptions everywhere. The main street was packed dirt and horse droppings, and the occasional whiskey bottle someone had pitched from the saloon's narrow porch. There was a dry goods store, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a church whose bell had cracked 3 summers ago and never been replaced, and there was the boarding house that belonged to Ada Wilcox, which was the nicest building on the street because Ada made it so with her own 2 hands and her own absolute refusal to let anything under her care fall to ruin. She was 26 years old, and she had been running that boarding house alone for 2 years. Before that, she had run it alongside her husband, Robert Wilcox, who had been a decent man, if not a particularly strong one, and who had died of a fever in the spring of 1876, without leaving her much of anything except the building itself and a modest debt to the bank in Santa Fe. She had paid off that debt inside of 14 months by working hours that would have felled a lesser person, taking in washing and mending on top of the rooms and the meals. And she had done it without complaint, because complaining was not something Ada Wilcox was built for. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned tightly beneath a cotton bonnet while she worked, and green eyes that people remembered long after they had forgotten her name, and a way of moving through a room that was brisk and purposeful without being unkind. She was not cold. She was simply a woman who had learned that efficiency was a form of survival, and she wore that knowledge the way other women wore jewelry, constantly, and not always by choice. It was on that October afternoon, a Tuesday with the smell of cedar smoke on the air, and the aspen trees on the hillside gone entirely gold, that Louis Walker rode into Redrock Crossing. He came from the south, which was not unusual. Most travelers came from the south because that was where the main trail ran. But Louis Walker rode differently than most travelers. He was not in any hurry that was visible, and yet there was something deliberate about the pace he set, as though he had thought carefully about every mile and had decided exactly how much energy to give each one. He was 29 years old, lean in the way that comes from genuine labor rather than deprivation, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps a week. He wore a plain brown coat over a blue flannel shirt, and his hat was a battered affair that had once been black and was now something closer to the color of old ash. He carried a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver on his hip, but he wore both the way working men wore tools rather than the way dangerous men wore weapons. His horse was a sorrel mare named Bess, who was the most sensible animal in the territory and who had, on more than one occasion, exercised better judgment than her rider. Louis Walker was not a drifter in the way the word usually implied, meaning without purpose or character. He had spent the last 7 years working cattle drives and ranch hands across Texas, Arizona, and now New Mexico, and he was very good at it, and he had reached the age of 29 with the quiet and slightly unsettling realization that being very good at something was not the same as being fulfilled by it. He had enough money saved that he had been looking, in a loose and uncommitted way, at parcels of land. He had stopped in Redrock Crossing because Bess had thrown a shoe 3 miles out, and because the blacksmith in Redrock Crossing was reputed to be the best in the county. He did not expect anything more from the town than a rishad horse and perhaps a hot meal. The hot meal was where Ada Wilcox came in. The boarding house dining room served supper to non-residents for 15 cents a plate, a fact advertised on a hand-lettered sign in the front window that Louis Walker read while his mare was being seen to at the livery. He had not eaten since breakfast, and breakfast had been hardtack and cold coffee eaten in the saddle, so the sign held considerable appeal. He came in at 5:30, when the dining room was already occupied by 4 other men, 2 of them railroad surveyors passing through, one of them a traveling merchant named Deakins who came through Redrock Crossing every 6 weeks and always requested the corner table, and one of them, a young ranch hand named Percy who boarded there permanently, and who ate with the single-minded devotion of someone who had spent considerable time going without. Ada was bringing out a tureen of beef stew when Louis Walker pushed open the door and took off his hat. She noticed him the way she noticed everyone who came in, swiftly and practically, cataloging him without seeming to look directly at him. Tall, clean enough for a man who'd been on the road, polite enough to remove his hat, she gestured toward the one remaining empty table without breaking her stride. "Sit anywhere that's free," she said. "Stew tonight with cornbread, coffee's on the sideboard." "Thank you, ma'am," Louis said. He sat and he poured his own coffee and he ate when she brought the stew, and he said thank you again when she came to collect the bowl, and that was the entirety of their first meeting. He paid his 15 cents and he left, and Ada Wilcox did not think about him again that evening, except to note that he had been tidier about his table than the surveyors. Louis Walker, for his part, thought about her slightly more than he intended to. It was not a dramatic thing, nothing so sudden or obvious as a thunderclap. It was quieter than that. It was the way she moved through the dining room with complete self-possession, as though the space belonged to her not by deed but by character, which it did. It was the way she spoke to the young ranch hand Percy with the same brisk courtesy she extended to the traveling merchant. No performance of warmth but no withholding of it either. He found himself wondering, as he walked back toward the livery to check on Bess, what had built a woman like that, what it had cost her. He told himself it was none of his business and went to sleep in the stable loft because it was cheaper than a room, and he had grown up sleeping in worse places. The next morning, the blacksmith informed him that Bess had a hairline crack developing in her left front hoof wall, and that she would need at least 4 days of rest and careful attention before she was fit for hard travel. Louis Walker stood outside the blacksmith shop in the thin morning light and considered this information with the resignation of a man who was used to the world having its own schedule. 4 days in Redrock Crossing. He supposed it could be worse. He went back to the boarding house and asked about a room. Ada Wilcox looked at him from behind the small reception counter in the front hallway, that same quick assessment she gave everyone, and told him the rate was $4 a week including breakfast and supper, or he could pay 50 cents a night without meals. "Week rate," he said. "I won't need the full week, but I reckon 4 days is close enough." She wrote his name in the ledger in her careful, upright hand, Louis Walker. She showed him to the second room on the upper floor, which had a single window that faced the bluffs and a narrow iron bed, and a washstand and a hook on the back of the door. It was clean in the way that spoke of genuine care rather than just the absence of visible dirt. "Breakfast at 7, supper at 6, she told him. "Washing water's available in the morning. If you need your clothes laundered, the rate is separate." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She left him to it, and he stood at the window for a moment looking at the rust-colored bluffs, and then he unpacked his single saddlebag and washed his face and went out to acquaint himself with the town. Redrock Crossing in the autumn of 1878 was a community in the particular kind of tension that settled over small western towns in that era, when the question of who was going to own the future, the old ranching families or the new commercial interests, had not yet been resolved, and everyone could feel the unresolved quality of it like a tooth that was not quite right. There were large cattle operations to the north and west, and there were men who wanted to bring more settlement to the valley, and there were Mescalero Apache families who had been displaced from their traditional lands by a combination of federal policy and ranching expansion, and whose situation was unjust and acknowledged as such by exactly no one in any position to do anything about it, at least not in Redrock Crossing. Louis Walker had ridden through enough of the territory to have formed opinions about this that were more nuanced than most, having known Apache men and women as individuals over the course of his travels, in ways that complicated the easy stories people told. He kept those opinions largely to himself, as a practical matter, but they were there. He spent that first full day in town quietly. He had a beer at the saloon, not because he was particularly inclined toward drink, but because the saloon was where information moved. He played 2 hands of cards and lost one and won one, and listened to what people talked about. He gathered that there was a rancher named Cole Beaumont who owned the largest operation in the valley and who was not universally beloved. He gathered that the bank in Santa Fe had sent a man named Hicks to assess properties for potential foreclosure. He gathered that the winter coming looked to be a hard one. The old-timers were reading the signs in the behavior of the elk and the thickness of the cottonwood bark, and they were worried. He ate supper at the boarding house that evening, and this time he was the last one to come in, and the dining room had thinned out, and Ada Wilcox brought his stew, and then, instead of turning immediately away, she paused. "You're staying the week," she said. It was not quite a question. "My horse threw a shoe and came up with a crack in her hoof," he said. "The blacksmith says 4 days minimum before she can travel." "Calhoun's good," Ada said, meaning the blacksmith. "If he says 4 days, it might be 6, but she'll be right when he's done." "That's reassuring," Louis said. "About the being right part, less so about the 6 days part." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. "There are worse places to wait out a week," she said. "I'm beginning to think so," he said, and he meant it to refer to the town, but the way it came out was not entirely about the town, and he knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Ada Wilcox looked at him for one brief, measuring moment, and then she went back to the kitchen, and Louis Walker ate his stew and tried to remember what he had been thinking about before he rode into Redrock Crossing. He could not quite recall. Over the next 2 days, a pattern established itself without either of them particularly designing it. Louis would come to breakfast and be one of the last to leave, not lingering obviously but moving without hurry, and Ada would refill his coffee without being asked, because she refilled everyone's coffee, and this was not a particular statement. In the evenings he would come to supper, and occasionally, when the other diners had gone and the room had quieted, they would exchange a few words. She told him about the town with the directness of someone who knew a place thoroughly and saw no reason to either sell it or disparage it. He told her about places he had been in the same way, matter-of-factly, the good and the less good. He learned on the second evening that she was a widow, and he received this information with the careful neutrality of a man who understood it was not a simple thing. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's been 2 years," she said, in a tone that did not dismiss the loss but had made a kind of accommodation with it. "You learn to carry things differently." "Yes," he said, in a way that suggested he knew something about that himself, though he did not elaborate and she did not press. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that over those 2 days Louis Walker had become something of a quiet presence in the town beyond the walls of her dining room. He had helped old Mr. Garza, who lived at the edge of town and who had been a vaquero before his knees gave out, carry 3 heavy sacks of winter grain to his cellar without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. He had spotted a loose board on the church steps that was a genuine hazard, and had taken 45 minutes on Wednesday morning to nail it properly back into place, using a hammer he borrowed from the blacksmith. And when the minister, Reverend Holt, came out to thank him, Louis had simply said he had time on his hands and left it at that. Reverend Holt mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to Martha Delaney, who ran the dry goods store. Martha Delaney mentioned it to Ada Wilcox on Thursday morning when Ada came in for flour and salt. "Your boarder's a useful man," Martha said, in the tone of someone imparting a compliment but also conducting a small investigation. "He seems capable," Ada said, keeping her voice mild in the way she kept everything mild when Redrock Crossing was paying attention. "He fixed the church steps," Martha said, "and I heard he helped Garza with his grain, just because." Ada received this information and put it away carefully and did not examine it until later, when she was alone in her kitchen mixing the next morning's bread and the house was quiet around her. A man who did things just because. That was either very good or a performance of very good, and she had been around long enough to know the difference mattered enormously. On Thursday evening, Louis came to supper and ate and stayed talking longer than he had before, and this time it was not quite so incidental. Percy the ranch hand had gone to bed early with a headache, and the surveyors had eaten quickly and left for the saloon, and the traveling merchant deacons had packed up and moved on that morning, so it was just Louis at his table and Ada moving around the dining room. And when she sat down for a moment at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door with her own cup of coffee, the distance between sitting together and sitting at separate tables collapsed somewhat. He told her about a valley in southern Arizona he had passed through 2 years ago, wide and golden in the autumn with the saguaros going copper in the late light. He described it in plain, specific language that made it easy to see, and she listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I haven't been much of anywhere," she said. "Came here from Missouri when I was 19 and I've been here since." "Do you want to go places?" he asked, not pushing, genuinely asking. She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I want to make this place what it should be. Does that make sense?" "It makes a great deal of sense," he said. They sat in a brief, easy silence, and it was the kind of silence that only develops between people who have established enough comfort to stop filling every gap with noise. And for two people who had known each other for 3 days, it was telling. Friday morning brought the news, carried by the rider who came up from the south, that a group of men employed by Cole Beaumont had pushed a Mescalero family off their campsite at the creek 3 miles east of town, roughly and without legal cause, confiscating what supplies they could carry and leaving the family, a man and his wife and their 2 young children and an elderly grandfather, with nothing but what they had on their backs in 40-degree weather. This news hit the town in different ways. Some people shrugged. Some people shook their heads with genuine regret, but felt there was nothing to be done. Martha Delaney at the dry goods store quietly put together a box of supplies, flour and dried beans and salt pork and blankets, and set it by her back door, though she was uncertain how to get it to the people who needed it. Ada Wilcox heard about it from Percy, who had ridden out to the East Creek that morning for reasons of his own and come back troubled. She went immediately to Martha Delaney's back door. "I'll take the box," Ada said. "I know where the East Creek campsite is. Robert used to fish there." "Ada, Beaumont's men might still be." "I'll take the box," Ada said again, quietly but with the finality that closed that particular discussion. She was hitching her wagon in the livery when Louis Walker appeared at the stable door. He had seen her moving with unusual purpose from his window and had followed the instinct to find out why. She told him, briefly and without drama. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't need to," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer and then turned back to the horse. "Then get up on the wagon," she said. They drove east in the sharp Friday morning air, with the box of supplies in the wagon bed. Louis sat beside her on the bench, and they did not talk much, but there was something between them that had not been there before, a shared direction, and it had weight to it that was different from conversation. The Mescalero family was where Percy had said, huddled in the thin brush along the creek bank with a small fire that was not doing enough work against the cold. The man, whose name was Chayton, regarded the approaching wagon with wariness that was entirely earned and entirely understandable given the morning he had had. His grandfather, an old man with a deeply lined face and quiet, watchful eyes, sat very still. Ada climbed down from the wagon and carried the box to the edge of their camp, and she spoke plainly and without condescension, explaining what was in the box and that it was theirs to use. Chayton's wife, a woman about Ada's own age, took the blankets first and wrapped them around the children, and something in her expression acknowledged Ada's gesture without requiring it to be made into anything larger than what it was. Louis unloaded the remaining supplies from the wagon. He spoke a few words to Chayton in halting Spanish, which was the language available to them, and Chayton responded with a brevity that was not unfriendly, and they understood each other well enough. On the drive back into town, Ada was quiet for a long stretch of miles. Then she said, "Beaumont does what he wants because nobody stops him." "That's a common situation in a lot of places," Louis said. "It's wrong," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him sidelong, and something in her expression shifted in a way she did not entirely intend, a softening that she caught and did not quite conceal before it passed. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wanted to," he said. That evening at supper they did not speak of it because there were other ears in the room, but when Louis came down to help her carry the heavy pot of water in from the back porch without being asked, she did not tell him she could manage it herself, which she could. She simply let him help, and that was its own kind of conversation. Saturday was the day that changed things. Calhoun the blacksmith had good news and complicated news. Bess's hoof was looking better than expected, which was the good news. The complicated news was that a cold front had come through overnight, bringing temperatures that had dropped 15 degrees and a wind out of the northwest that cut through everything, and that by nightfall it would be genuinely dangerous to be outside without shelter. Louis Walker stood in the livery with his hands in his pockets and looked at his horse, who looked back at him with the patience of a sensible animal, and he thought about the fact that his week was up tomorrow, and he still had not made a decision about where he was going next. And for the first time in 7 years of moving, the lack of a destination felt like a problem worth solving rather than a freedom worth celebrating. He went back to the boarding house and paid Ada for another 3 days. She wrote his name in the ledger again, and if she was pleased, she gave no particular sign of it, but her pen moved across the page with a certain quietness that might have meant something if a person was paying close attention, which Louis Walker was. That Saturday afternoon, he sat in the boarding house's small front parlor, which Ada kept for the use of boarders, and he read from one of the 3 books on the shelf there, a copy of Dickens that was missing its cover and had clearly been read many times. Ada came through twice on errands of her own, and the second time she noticed what he was reading, and she said, "That's the best of the 3, in my opinion." "Have you read it?" he asked. "Twice," she said. "I'll read it again when I'm old." She said it with a slight warmth that was almost playful, and then she was gone back to the kitchen. Louis sat with the book in his lap and thought about a woman who planned to be old in a place she had chosen, who carried grief without being defined by it, who drove a wagon to a creek in the cold to bring blankets to people she did not know because it was simply what ought to be done. He thought about this with a rising clarity that was both welcome and terrifying. That evening, Cole Beaumont came to the boarding house. He was a large man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who had been told yes for 20 years by everyone around him. He had 2 ranch hands with him who stayed on the porch while Beaumont himself came through the door, filling the hallway with his presence and his tobacco smell. Ada was at the reception counter. She looked at Beaumont without any particular expression. "Ada," Beaumont said, in the way of a man who believed first names were his to use. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "Can I help you with something? I hear you took supplies out to those Apache folks on the East Creek this morning," Beaumont said. "I'm going to ask you not to do that again." Ada's chin lifted approximately 1 millimeter. "Are you going to ask me," she said, "or tell me?" "Ada, I don't want to be unpleasant about this." "Then don't be," she said. But also be aware that what I do with my own supplies on public roads is not your business, Mr. Beaumont." Louis Walker appeared in the doorway to the parlor at this moment, quietly, without fanfare, but with the particular stillness of a man who has assessed a situation and taken a position within it. He did not say anything. He simply was there, and his presence was sufficient. Beaumont looked at him. "Who are you?" "A boarder," Louis said pleasantly. Beaumont looked between them, recalculating something. He was not a stupid man, whatever else he was. He seemed to decide that this particular evening was not the moment he wanted to pursue. "Think about what I said, Ada," he said, and went back out through the door. Percy, who had been hovering at the top of the stairs, came down partway and said, "That man is a genuine piece of work." "Percy," Ada said, without looking up from the ledger she had returned to as though nothing had happened, "go to bed." Later, when the house was quiet and the wind was picking up outside, Louis sat in the parlor and Ada came in to bank the fire for the night, and he said, without looking away from the flames, "He's going to cause you trouble." "He's been trying to cause me trouble for 2 years, Ada said, crouching by the fireplace with the poker. "He wanted to buy this building when Robert died and I didn't sell it. He's been annoyed about that ever since." "Did he threaten you then?" "He made suggestions," she said dryly. "He's good at suggestions." Louis turned to look at her profile in the firelight. She was matter-of-fact about it, but he could see the thin tension around her jaw that she would not have let anyone see who was not sitting this close to her in a room this quiet. "You're not afraid of him," he said. "I'm not," she said. "But I'm not foolish about him either. There's a difference between fearlessness and stupidity." "Yes," he said, "there is." She stood, and she was very close to him in the small room, and the fire was warm, and the wind outside had risen to a low howl against the window glass. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, and he thought she might say something, but instead she straightened and said, "Good night, Mr. Walker," and went upstairs. He sat by the fire for another hour and listened to the wind. Sunday in Redrock Crossing was church for those who went to church, and rest for those who didn't. And for Ada Wilcox, it was the one morning of the week when the breakfast was simple, biscuits and jam and coffee, rather than the full hot meal she put out the other 6 days, and she sat for a short while after the boarders had eaten before rising to begin the rest of her day. Louis came to church. He had not intended to, exactly, but he had seen Ada walk past the parlor window in a dark blue dress with her hair down slightly from its usual severe arrangement, and he had decided that finding out what Reverend Holt said from the crackbell pulpit was a worthwhile way to spend an hour. He sat 2 rows back and to the left, and he was able to see her profile through the service, and she was entirely focused on Reverend Holt except for once, right in the middle of the sermon, when she turned her head as if she had felt something and their eyes met for a brief, warm second before she turned back. Reverend Holt's sermon was about steadfastness. Louis thought, sitting in the hard pew with the November wind pressing at the boards of the old church, that it was an apt topic for the day and possibly for him personally. After the service, standing in the sharp Sunday morning air outside the church, Louis was introduced to various townspeople by virtue of simply being present, and Ada being the sort of person whose proximity meant introductions. He met Martha Delaney properly, and the Reverend and his wife, and 2 farmers from the outer edges of the valley who had ridden in for Sunday services, and had the worn, careful look of men who watched the weather the way other men watched the stock markets. Ada moved through these interactions with the ease of someone who was known and trusted, and Louis watched her from a slight distance and felt, with increasing and somewhat inconvenient conviction, that this was a woman worth staying for. He had not stayed anywhere in 7 years. The idea of staying had always felt like defeat, like surrendering the idea that something better might exist just over the next ridge. But watching Ada Wilcox stand in the November sunlight outside a church with a cracked bell, talking to farmers about whether the winter would be as hard as the old-timers predicted, he had the distinct and unnerving thought that he had already found the better thing, and had almost ridden past it. Sunday afternoon brought a development that nobody had been expecting. The man from the Santa Fe Bank, Hicks, arrived in town on the afternoon stage and took a room at the boarding house, because it was the only place in Redrock Crossing that had rooms. He was a thin, precise man in his mid-40s who wore a suit that was too thin for the weather and had the expression of someone perpetually adding figures in his head. Louis heard him at the reception counter talking to Ada about his business, which was the assessment of several properties in the valley, and he heard Ada's voice go very careful and controlled in a way that told him this was not entirely comfortable territory for her. Later, he asked Percy about it. Percy, who had absolutely no discretion whatsoever, and who was therefore an excellent source of information, told him that Ada had fully paid off her debt to the Santa Fe Bank 18 months ago, which was genuinely impressive, but that Beaumont had been making noises about some additional claim on the property related to a water right that was disputed, and that there was a concern, not a certainty but a concern, that this bank man's visit was not unrelated to Beaumont's maneuverings. Louis sat with this information for the rest of Sunday afternoon and into the evening. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's troubles by default, having learned through experience that well-intentioned involvement often made things worse. But this was different in ways he was only beginning to fully articulate to himself. That Sunday evening, he had a conversation with Ada that was different from their previous conversations in quality and tone, because for the first time there was something deliberate on both sides, a stepping toward each other that they were both aware of and neither fully acknowledged. They were in the parlor again, the house quiet around them, and she had her mending and he had his Dickens, and at some point they had stopped doing the things they were ostensibly doing and were simply talking. She told him about Robert, not much but enough, that he had been a good man who had loved her, that the fever had taken him quickly, which was a mercy if such things could be called merciful, that she had found herself in the immediate aftermath of grief, not only heartbroken but fiercely determined, as though grief had boiled something essential in her down to its most concentrated form, and that form was the decision to survive and to make something of what she had. He told her about his own losses, which were of a different kind. His mother had died when he was 12. His father had been a man of great ambition and limited follow-through who had eventually drifted into a kind of permanent westward movement that was more running than seeking, and Louis had spent his 20s trying to determine which of those impulses lived in him too. "What did you decide?" Ada asked. "I'm still deciding," he said honestly. And then, after a pause, "Though I think the answer is becoming clearer." She held his gaze for one long, quiet moment, and he saw in her expression something warm and uncertain and carefully held, like a fire that had been allowed to start but whose keeper was not yet sure of it. "I should check on the guests," she said, and rose with her mending, and left him sitting in the firelight feeling like a man who had just glimpsed something extraordinary through a window and was not yet certain the window would open. Monday was ordinary in its practical details and extraordinary in the way that days become extraordinary when they are lived in proximity to a feeling that is growing large enough to be impossible to ignore. Louis helped Calhoun at the livery in the morning, not because it was asked of him, but because his hands needed something to do and Calhoun was grateful for it. He rode Bess around the edge of town in the afternoon to test her hoof, and she was moving well, and he felt the first clear sign that his time in Redrock Crossing was objectively limited, and the feeling that came with it was not relief. He went to the dry goods store for tobacco he did not entirely need, and found himself in conversation with Martha Delaney, who was the kind of person who had been watching everything that happened in her town for 30 years, and had no difficulty whatsoever discussing her observations. "Staying on," she said, not as a question. "A few more days," he said. Martha Delaney looked at him with the directness of a woman who had no time for performances. "Ada Wilcox is the best person in this town," she said. "I want you to know that so you understand the stakes." Louis looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. I'm coming to understand them." Martha seemed satisfied with this and rang up his tobacco with the precision of someone who had said what she meant to say and needed nothing further. Monday evening, Hicks the bank man was at supper, and so was Cole Beaumont, and this combination told Louis everything he needed to know about the nature of Hicks's visit. They sat at adjacent tables and spoke in low voices that they clearly believed were lower than they were. And Louis, sitting alone at his table with excellent hearing, and the practiced stillness of a man who had spent years on cattle drives where reading situations was survival, caught enough to understand that Beaumont was pressing a claim about a water right attached to the boarding house property, and that Hicks was there to evaluate whether the bank had any reason to revisit Ada's title. The claim was almost certainly fraudulent. The water right in question related to a small seasonal creek behind the property that had been included in the original deed transfer when Ada and Robert Wilcox purchased the building. Beaumont was arguing that the right had been improperly transferred, a legal fiction that would require either a lawyer or someone with genuine knowledge of property law to dismantle. Louis Walker had neither precisely. But he knew enough from years of working land to know when a water right argument was real, and when it was a lever being used for other purposes. That evening after supper, he knocked on Ada's kitchen door, and she opened it with a dish towel in her hands and flour on her wrist from the next morning's bread. And he said, quietly but directly, that she needed to know what he had overheard. She listened without interrupting, standing in the kitchen doorway with the warm light behind her and the cold November dark beyond the back porch, and her expression went through several things: surprise, then a kind of controlled anger, then a settling into something that was not quite resolved but was close to it. "I have the deed," she said, "and I have Robert's original papers from the purchase. The water right is clearly included." "Then you should write to a lawyer in Santa Fe," Louis said, "before Beaumont can move on this." "I know," she said, and then in a slightly different voice, "Thank you for telling me." "Of course," he said. She looked at him for a moment in that way she sometimes looked at him, like she was reading something in him she was not entirely sure how to translate. "You're a good man, Louis Walker," she said, and it came out with a simplicity that made it more than a compliment. It was more like a conclusion she had arrived at and decided to state aloud. He did not know exactly what to say to that, so he said, "Good night, Ada," and walked back around to the front of the house, and stood for a moment in the cold night air looking up at the stars, which were extraordinarily clear in the way they only get when a very cold front is settling in. He was considerably warmer than the temperature warranted. Tuesday brought the letter. Ada wrote it that morning at her desk in the small office behind the kitchen, a careful, precise account of the water right situation addressed to a lawyer in Santa Fe, whose name Reverend Holt had supplied, a man named Garrett who was known to be both capable and honest. She sealed it and gave it to the stage driver to carry south, and then she went back to work, and that was what she was doing when Cole Beaumont's ranch hands rode past the front of the boarding house twice in the morning and twice in the afternoon, slow and deliberate, not doing anything threatening exactly but being present in the manner of a threat. Ada watched the second pass from the window and her jaw tightened and she said nothing. Louis saw it too. He sat with it. He was not a man who solved things with his fists or his gun if there was another way, and he had survived long enough in difficult country to know that most situations resolved better with patience and intelligence than with dramatics. But he was also honest enough to acknowledge that patience had its limits, and he did not particularly care for the sight of men riding slowly past Ada Wilcox's window as though she were a thing that could be made to feel small. He went out that afternoon and had a conversation with Beaumont's ranch hands, not a confrontational one, but a clear one. He introduced himself with perfect courtesy, explained that he was a boarder at the house and would be in town for some time, and then said with the same pleasant tone that if they had business with Mrs. Wilcox, they were welcome to knock on the door and conduct it properly, and that the riding past was, in his observation, beginning to look like something that might require the attention of the county sheriff, who he had noticed was due in town on Thursday. The ranch hands looked at him. They were young, both of them, younger than Louis by several years, and they had the not-quite-hardened quality of men who did what they were paid to do without having fully committed to what kind of men they wanted to be. "We're just riding," one of them said. "Then ride somewhere else," Louis said, still pleasantly, and went back inside. They did not ride past again that day. Louis did not mention it to Ada, because she had enough to manage and because it had not escalated to anything that required her management. He simply absorbed it and moved on to other things. The other things, on this particular Tuesday afternoon, involved the discovery that the boarding house's back porch railing was rotting at 2 of the support posts in a way that would be genuinely dangerous once the ice came, as it would within the week by all indications. He found the tools in the back shed and he spent 2 hours replacing the posts with wood from a section of spare lumber he found stacked against the shed wall, and he was finishing up and testing the strength of the railing when Ada came out with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the work. She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "It was going to fall," he said simply. She handed him a coffee and sat on the step just inside the new railing, and he sat on the lower step with his coffee warming his hands, and the afternoon was cold but still, without the wind that had been punishing the valley for 2 days, and the light on the bluffs had gone the particular deep copper orange of late November in New Mexico that turned the whole world into something that looked too beautiful to be real. "Why are you still here?" she asked. She said it without accusation, genuinely curious, the way she asked things when she wanted to know the actual answer. Louis considered the question seriously. "My horse is still mending," he said. "And I find I have no particular urgency to leave." "Where were you going before Bess threw her shoe?" "Nowhere specific," he said. "North generally. I had it in mind to look at some land up near the Cimarron River country." "That's good land up there," she said. "It is," he said, "or there's land here." The words settled between them like something that had weight. Ada looked out at the bluffs. Louis watched her profile. "People will talk," she said. "People always talk," he said. "Does that change what's true?" She looked back at him, and there it was again, that expression she carried sometimes when she was not guarding it as carefully as she usually did, warm and careful and uncertain and wanting. "I don't know what's true yet," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'd like to find out if that's agreeable to you." Ada Wilcox held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at this man sitting on her back porch step in the copper afternoon light. This man who had ridden in with a broken-shoed horse and fixed her porch railing without being asked, and driven to the creek in the cold with blankets, and stood quietly in her hallway when Beaumont came to make suggestions. And she thought about what it meant to be a woman who had already built something from the rubble of grief, and whether there was room in what she had built for something new. "Yes," she said quietly, "it's agreeable." Louis Walker had not smiled often in the preceding weeks, not with any real depth, but he smiled then, and it changed his whole face, and Ada saw it and felt it go into her chest like warmth. That was Tuesday afternoon, the 15th of November in the year 1878. What followed was a week that moved both very slowly and very fast, in the way that time moves when it is full of things that matter. Louis walked with Ada on Wednesday morning along the path that ran behind the boarding house toward the creek. Not the East Creek, but the smaller seasonal one that was relevant to the water right dispute. And they talked about the land, and about what she had built here, and about what might be possible. He told her more about his years on the cattle drives, the good night-loving trail and then work farther west, and she listened with genuine interest and asked questions that revealed she had thought carefully about the economics and practicalities of things. He told her he had been looking at land for 2 years in a loose way and had never committed to any of it. "What were you waiting for?" she asked. He thought about it. "To want something enough to stay," he said. She looked at him. "And now?" "Now I want to know what your answer would be," he said, "if I told you I was thinking of staying in this valley." Ada stopped walking. They were at the edge of the creek, which was thin and cold and running quietly over flat stones. The trees along the bank had dropped all their leaves and the branches were silver gray against the sky. "My answer," she said carefully, "would depend on your reasons." "My reasons," he said, equally carefully, "are standing next to me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. Then she said, with the slight roughness in her voice that meant she was genuinely moved and was managing it, "Don't say things like that unless you mean them for the long term, Louis. I've already put myself back together once, and I'm not interested in doing it again." "I mean them for the long term," he said, and his voice was steady in the way of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. She turned to look at him, and what passed between them in that moment was sufficient. Not a declaration with ribbons on it, not a performance of feeling, but something true and clear and mutually received. They walked back to the boarding house in a comfortable silence that was different from all previous silences between them. Thursday came with the county sheriff, a capable man named Aldridge who came through Redrock Crossing once every 2 weeks as part of his circuit. Louis went to speak with him about the Beaumont situation, both the riding past the boarding house and the original matter of the Mescalero family, and Aldridge listened with the attention of a man who had been doing his job long enough to know which problems got worse if left alone and which solved themselves. Beaumont was a name he knew. The Apache displacement was a matter, he said carefully, that was above the level of what he could address alone, but that he would make a report, which was something if not enough. The riding past the boarding house was harassment, and he said he would pay a visit to Beaumont's ranch on his way out of town to make his position on harassment clear. He did. Cole Beaumont was not pleased, but he was also not a man who wanted the direct attention of the law, and the rides past the boarding house stopped. Thursday evening, the temperature dropped sharply. By the time supper was over and the boarders had gone to their rooms and Percy to his, the thermometer on the boarding house porch read 18 degrees, and the wind had come back from the northwest with a particular intensity that rattled the window panes. Ada built up the parlor fire and then went around the house, closing every gap she could find against the cold, stuffing rolled rags against the base of the front door, checking the window latches, making sure the fireplaces in the upper rooms were drawing properly. Louis helped her with this methodically and without fuss, and at some point they were at adjacent windows checking the same latch and their hands came close together on the wooden frame and neither moved away. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. And then, with the extraordinary care of two people who are both aware that this is a threshold and have decided together to cross it, he lowered his head and she lifted her face, and they kissed, gently and briefly, in the lamplight of the upper hallway with the wind howling outside and the whole cold world locked out beyond the walls of the boarding house. When it ended, she looked at him, and she was not flustered, not Ada Wilcox, but there was a brightness in her eyes that had not been there before. "Good night, Louis," she said softly. "Good night, Ada," he said, and they went to their respective rooms with an extraordinary and mutual tenderness. What neither of them knew yet, what would not become clear until dawn, was what was going to happen that night. Friday morning arrived with the particular silence that very cold nights leave behind, a muffled, breathless quality to the world that meant the temperature had dropped below what the thermometer could reliably measure, and everything outside had gone still and crystalline. Ada woke at her usual hour before 6. She dressed by candlelight and went downstairs to start the kitchen fire and put the coffee on and begin the biscuits, because Friday was full breakfast day, and she had 5 guests including the bank man Hicks, who required feeding before he left on the early stage. She went about these preparations in the ordinary way, moving through her kitchen in the dark pre-dawn with the ease of complete familiarity, the matches and the kindling and the water from the pump that had not yet frozen because she had left a small fire in the stove overnight. The kitchen warmed. The coffee came to its boil. She had the biscuits in the oven and was beginning to slice the salt pork when she thought to check the front porch for the wood she had asked Percy to stack there yesterday. She opened the front door, and there was Louis Walker, sitting with his back against the doorframe and his knees drawn up and his hat pulled low and his coat wrapped around him, entirely asleep in the gray pre-dawn light, white with frost. Ada's heart stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth and stood absolutely still for one suspended second. Then she was on her knees beside him, her hand on his shoulder, shaking. "Louis, Louis, wake up!" He stirred. He came awake slowly, the way a very cold person does, fighting through layers of cold and sleep, and his eyes opened and found her face, and in them was a disorientation that gave way immediately to something much softer. "Ada," he said, in a rough and sleepy voice. "What on earth are you doing?" she said, and her voice broke on it, which was not something that happened to Ada Wilcox very often, and she was alarmed by it and did not try to stop it. He looked at her for a moment, blinking in the dawn, and then he seemed to remember. He said, slowly and a little thickly, "I heard something last night, around 2 in the morning. Thought I heard someone at the front of the house, somebody trying the door, came down to check." And she said, "Nothing there," he said. "Beaumont's men or just the wind, I don't know. Either way, I didn't want to leave you without someone out here in case they came back." Ada stared at him. "You sat out here all night," she said, "in 18-degree weather." "It wasn't 18 degrees all night," he said with a mild attempt at reassurance. "It warmed up some toward dawn." "Louis Walker," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet in the way that meant she was feeling something very large. "You could have frozen out here." "I had my coat," he said. "Your coat," she said, and it came out half exasperated and half something else entirely, something that was not exasperation at all. She put her hand against his cheek, where the skin was cold and rough with stubble and frost. He turned his face slightly into her hand the way a man does when he has been cold for a long time and warmth finds him. "Come inside," she said. "Right now. Come inside and get warm." She helped him up, because his legs were stiff with cold, and she brought him into the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house, and pushed him into the chair nearest the stove, and pressed a hot cup of coffee into his hands before he was fully oriented. She pulled his coat off him and hung it near the stove to dry, and she checked his hands and his ears for the waxy white of frostbite and found none, thank God, and then she stood in front of him with her arms crossed and looked at him. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked back at her over the rim of it, and he had the expression of a man who is not entirely sure whether he is about to be thanked or scolded and is at peace with either outcome. "Why didn't you wake me?" she said. "You needed sleep," he said, "and it was probably nothing. I just didn't want to risk leaving you unguarded and being wrong." Ada Wilcox looked at this man sitting in her kitchen chair with frost still in his hair and a coffee cup in his stiff hands, who had sat outside her door all night in the cold without telling her, without making a performance of it, without expecting anything from it, just because he had decided she ought to have someone standing watch, and he was the one standing watch. Something cracked open in her chest, not in a painful way. In the way that things that have been closed very carefully for a very long time sometimes open when the right warmth finds them. She crossed the kitchen and knelt beside his chair, and she took his cold hands in hers around the coffee cup, and she looked up at him with her eyes bright. "You are the most infuriating and the most good man I have ever met," she said. Louis looked down at her, and his expression was entirely unguarded for the first time she had seen. All the quiet restraint of it dissolved, and what was underneath was something so simple and so deep that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "I just wanted you to be safe," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying both things." He turned his hands in hers and held them, and they stayed that way in the warm kitchen while the biscuits finished baking and the world outside went slowly from gray to gold. And it was the most at peace Louis Walker had felt in longer than he could account for. The morning went on around them. The boarders came down for breakfast, Percy first, and then the surveyors, and finally Hicks the bank man. And Ada served breakfast with her characteristic efficiency, and Louis sat at his table and ate, and anyone watching would have seen only two people going about an ordinary morning. But Percy, who had come down earlier than usual and who was not as unobservant as he sometimes appeared, noticed that Ada's color was high in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen heat, and that Louis Walker sat in a different quality of stillness than he had sat in before. Percy ate his breakfast and said nothing, and was very pleased about everything. After Hicks and the surveyors had been collected by the morning stage and Percy had gone to the livery and the house was quiet, Ada came into the parlor where Louis was sitting. "I want to say something," she said, standing in the doorway. "All right," he said. "I have been very careful," she said, "for 2 years, about everything. About the bank and the business and Beaumont and what people think of me and whether I can hold all of this together. And I've been very careful about this." She made a small gesture that encompassed them, whatever this was between them. "Because I know what it costs to lose something you've given yourself to." "Yes," he said quietly. "But I also know," she said, "that being careful about everything is not the same as being wise about everything. And the wisest thing I can think of right now is to tell you that last night, when I found you at that door, I understood something that I had been walking toward for 2 weeks without letting myself look at it directly." "What did you understand?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "That I love you," she said, "and that I would like very much for you to stay." Louis Walker stood up. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, and he took her face in his hands, warm now, and he said, "I am not going anywhere. I am going to stay in this valley and find a piece of land and build something. And if you will have me, I would like to build it alongside you, and I would like it to be for the rest of my life." Ada looked up at him and she smiled, fully and without guard, and it was the best thing he had ever seen. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He kissed her then, properly, and she kissed him back with the full force of a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it, and it was one of those kisses that contain a whole future. The weeks that followed were not without their complications, because life is like that, but the complications were of the manageable kind and they faced them as what they now understood themselves to be: two people on the same side. The lawyer Garrett wrote back from Santa Fe in December. His letter was thorough and confident. The water right was clearly and legally part of Ada's deed. Beaumont's claim was an invention with no legal standing. Garrett offered to come to Redrock Crossing in January to make this formally clear to the bank's representative and to file the necessary documentation to close the issue permanently. Ada wrote back immediately to say yes. Cole Beaumont, when the legal reality became clear to him through channels that Garrett managed efficiently, did not trouble Ada Wilcox again. He was a man who understood leverage, and when leverage was removed, he moved on to other calculations. He did not become a good man, but he became a less immediately troublesome one, and for the practical purposes of Ada's situation, that was sufficient. Christmas of 1878 in Redrock Crossing was cold and clear, and the kind of beautiful that the high desert manages in December when the snow is thin on the ground, but the air is perfectly still, and the stars are so bright they seem very close. Louis had moved from the boarding house into a rented room at the back of Calhoun's property, because propriety mattered in a small town and Ada's reputation was not something either of them was casual about. But he took his meals at the boarding house, and he worked with Calhoun during the days, learning the specific skills of the territory's land and animals in preparation for what he was planning. And in the evenings he sat in the parlor with Ada and they talked and read, and were together in the warm, quiet way of people who have found something real. He had made an inquiry about a parcel of land 4 miles north of town, 160 acres with good grass and a reliable water source, and a small existing structure that could be made into something solid with work. The owner, an elderly homesteader named Briggs who was moving east to live with his daughter, was willing to sell at a fair price. Louis had the money. He sat down with Ada on a Sunday afternoon in December and spread the survey map on the parlor table and showed her. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at him. "You be keeping the boarding house," he said. "This is your home. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. But if we were to win he stopped and started again more directly. Ada, I would like to ask you to marry me. The land would be ours. The boarding house would be ours. We would figure out together how both things work. Ada Wilcox looked at this man and the map in the future laid out in paper and ink and intention, and she said, "Yes, Louis Walker, I will marry you." He had bought the ring in Santa Fe, specifically, during a trip he had taken in mid-December on the pretext of delivering some paperwork to Calhoun's supplier. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, because turquoise was from this land and Ada was from this land, and it seemed right. He gave it to her on Christmas Eve, in the parlor in the firelight, and she held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and they both looked at it for a moment with the particular solemnity of people who understand what a thing means. "It's beautiful," she said. "You're beautiful," he said. She laughed a little, the kind of laugh that is surprised out of you, and the sound of it filled the room and filled him. They were married in January, on a Saturday, in the church with the cracked bell, by Reverend Holt. The whole town came, because the whole town had been watching this develop since November and had opinions about it that were universally positive. Martha Delaney brought flowers she had preserved from her autumn garden. Percy wore his cleanest shirt and cried silently during the vows in a way he would deny for years afterward. Old Mr. Garza came on his bad knees and sat in the front row and nodded throughout the service with the satisfaction of someone who had seen things arranged as they should be. Ada wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, the same deep blue as the dress she had worn to church that first Sunday, and Louis thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, which was accurate. Their vows were short and plain and entirely sincere. He promised to stay and to honor and to love her, and she promised the same things in the same order, and Reverend Holt said they were married before God and the assembled people of Redrock Crossing, and Louis kissed his wife, and outside the cracked bell was rung anyway, producing its fractured but determined sound. They moved into the boarding house together, because it was her home and had been her home, and Louis's presence in it made it larger rather than smaller, made it warmer rather than crowded. He built a proper bedroom for them on the back of the first floor where there had been a storage room, adding windows that faced the bluffs so that Ada could see the copper light she loved in the evenings. The work took him 3 weeks, and Percy helped him on weekends, and they did it properly, with good lumber and proper joints. The land north of town was purchased from old Briggs in February, with the papers signed properly and witnessed by Reverend Holt. Louis began work on the land as soon as the spring thaw allowed, clearing and fencing and improving the small structure for when they needed it, though for now their life was centered at the boarding house, which continued to be the most reliably run establishment in Redrock Crossing under Ada's management. Spring came to the valley with the extravagance that the New Mexico high desert reserves for April, the sagebrush going silver green, the creek running full and cold with snowmelt, the bluffs above town burning in the evening light. Ada planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the boarding house, and Louis built her a proper fence for it, and she grew vegetables that she used in her cooking and flowers because flowers were allowed to exist for no practical reason at all. In early summer, they sat together on the back porch in the warm evening, Ada with her mending and Louis with a cup of coffee, and she told him, quietly and with a smile she could not quite contain, that she was expecting. Louis Walker sat very still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee with great care and turned to look at his wife. "Ada," he said. "Yes," she confirmed, her eyes bright. He reached across and took her hand, and his expression was everything he had spent 7 years on the road not having anywhere to put, all of it arriving at once, and it was tremendous and good. "Are you happy?" she asked because she wanted to hear it. "I am the happiest man in the New Mexico territory," he said, and meant it so completely that it required no embellishment. She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said, "because you're going to have to build more bookshelves." "I plan to read to this child constantly." He laughed, full and genuine. "Consider it done," he said. Their son was born in the following February, in 1880, in the middle of a warm spell that made the world feel like a gift. He was a strong, healthy boy who arrived in the early morning with the assistance of Martha Delaney, who had delivered half the children in the valley and had opinions about it. They named him James Robert Walker, the Robert for Ada's first husband who had been a decent man and deserved to be remembered, the James for no particular reason except that it was a good, solid name, and it suited him. Louis held his son in the warm bedroom while Ada slept, worn and satisfied, and he stood at the window that faced the bluffs and watched the February sunrise go from pink to gold to the full copper orange that Ada loved. And he thought about everything that Bess's thrown shoe had brought him to. And he was so grateful for the accident of it that it took him a moment to be able to breathe normally. Percy, who had become a permanent fixture and a genuinely devoted friend to both of them, came upstairs when he heard the baby and looked at the boy with transparent adoration. "He's very small," Percy said. "He won't always be," Louis said. "No," Percy agreed. "He won't." And then, in the tone of someone who has given a matter serious thought, "I would like to be his uncle, if that's acceptable." "Percy," Louis said, "you already are." Life in Redrock Crossing in the early 1880s was the kind of life that is lived in the particular texture of specific days, and those days were full. Ada ran the boarding house with her characteristic precision, though she had by this time taken on a hired girl named Ellen to help with the heavier work. Louis worked the land north of town, building the ranch into something real, running a small herd of cattle and 2 horses in addition to Bess, and taking on occasional work for Calhoun or for some of the other ranchers in the valley who had learned that he was capable and reliable. He was both these things, and more. The railroad came to a town 12 miles south of Redrock Crossing in 1882, and this changed the economics of the valley in ways that were both good and complicated. The boarding house saw more travelers, which was good for revenue. The cattle market improved with better access to eastern buyers, which was good for the ranch. But the railroad also brought a different character of development, more commercial and more volatile, and Redrock Crossing had to find its footing in a changing world. And it did, because the people in it were the kind who found footing. The Apache displacement that had happened in 1878 had not been the last of its kind, and the injustice of what had been done to Chayton's family and families like them continued to be real and largely unaddressed by the larger forces at work in the territory. Ada had maintained, over the years, a quiet and steady practice of fairness in her interactions with all people who came through her door, refusing to make her boarding house a place where anyone was treated as less, and Louis had continued his habit of seeing individuals as individuals. It was not large-scale justice, which was beyond their particular reach, but it was something, a small current of decency in a landscape that needed more of it. In the summer of 1882, James Walker, now 2.5 years old, discovered horses and became immediately obsessed with them, which surprised no one who knew his father. Louis began teaching him to sit in the saddle on the gentlest horse on the property, and the boy took to it with a gravity and a joy that made Ada stand at the fence with her hand shading her eyes and feel a warmth in her chest so large she sometimes wondered if she could contain it. "He's going to be a horseman," she told Louis one evening. "He's going to be whatever he decides to be," Louis said. "Yes," she said, "but he's also going to be a horseman." Louis looked at his son on the gentle mare and smiled. "Yes," he agreed, "he is." Martha Delaney's prediction had come true in a different way than she had perhaps intended. Ada Wilcox, who had become Ada Walker, was still the best person in Redrock Crossing, and Louis Walker was the man who had been good enough for her, which was a distinction the town conferred quietly and genuinely. In the autumn of that same year, Ada told him she was expecting again, and this time she told him in the kitchen in the morning before the boarders came down. And Louis was at the stove with his coffee, and he turned around, and she was standing in the doorway with that smile she had that was not quite contained. And he set down his coffee and crossed the kitchen and held her, and she leaned into him for a long, full moment. "James is going to be a terrible older brother for about 6 months," she said into his shoulder. Louis laughed. "And then he'll be the best one." "Yes," she said, "he will." The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1883, and they named her Clara, and she came into the world with a fierce and immediate personality that announced itself in the first hours and did not moderate much over the years. She had Ada's green eyes and Louis's dark hair, and an opinion about everything from approximately the age of 8 months. James, after the predicted 6 months of adjustment, became precisely the best older brother, protective and devoted and deeply invested in teaching Clara everything he knew, including how to ride, which Clara took to with even more apparent fearlessness than James had. The boarding house expanded in 1884, with a new wing built by Louis and Percy and 2 carpenters from the south, adding 3 rooms that made it the largest establishment of its kind in the valley, and with the railroad traffic it was full most weeks. Ada managed it with the help of Ellen and a second hired girl named Ruth, and she also found time to serve on the town's newly formed Board of Civic Improvements, which was responsible for, among other things, finally getting the church bell replaced with a new one that rang true. On the day the new bell was rung for the first time, Ada stood outside the church with Louis beside her and James on his other side and Clara in her arms, and the clear, true sound rolled out across the valley and up toward the bluffs, and she turned to look at Louis and he looked at her, and what passed between them did not require any words at all. Percy eventually married, in 1885, a cheerful and capable woman from the southern part of the territory named Grace, and they had a small house on the edge of town, and Percy continued to work for Louis on the ranch part-time, which was not a surprise to anyone. Percy and Grace came to Sunday supper at the boarding house so reliably that their chairs at the table were considered more or less permanent, and James and Clara called Grace their aunt and Percy their uncle, and the extended warmth of this arrangement was one of the particular goods of their life. The ranch grew. Louis was a careful and methodical man about the land, not taking on more than he could manage well, adding to the herd slowly and improving the infrastructure of the property in measured steps. By the mid-1880s, the Walker Ranch was a modest but solid and genuinely good operation, the kind that endures because it is built on reality rather than ambition alone. There were hard years, because there always are. The drought of 1886 was brutal, and the cattle market crashed the following year as a result of the big die-offs across the territory and beyond, and Louis lost a third of the herd and had to make calculations that were painful. But he and Ada sat together at the kitchen table with the ledgers and the reality of it, and they did not panic and they did not falter. And by 1888 they had rebuilt to where they had been, and the lesson was carried in the bones of the operation going forward. Ada's red gold hair, which Louis loved with a particular devotion he had never quite gotten over expressing, developed silver threads through it in her early 30s, which she found annoying, and which he found even more beautiful, and he told her so plainly and frequently enough that she stopped finding it annoying. In the evenings in the decade that followed their marriage, the pattern that had established itself in that first November held. The fire in the parlor, the book or the mending, the coffee, the conversation that wound through everything from the practical to the large. They talked about the territory's politics, which were moving towards statehood, though it would be many years yet. They talked about the children's futures, about James's growing seriousness and Clara's bright and pointed intelligence. They talked about land and weather and people they knew and things they had read, and sometimes they sat in the easy silence of 2 people who had no need to fill every moment with words because the presence itself was sufficient. On the evenings when the parlor was quiet and the house breathed around them with the familiar sounds of a place that was deeply known, Louis would sometimes look at Ada over the top of his book and find her already looking at him, and they would hold that look for a moment. These 2 people who had found each other through a thrown horseshoe and a 15-cent bowl of stew, and a week of November cold. And the whole of what they had made together would be present in that quiet room. James Walker grew into a young man who was his father's son in character. Quiet, capable, steady, with a genuinely good heart and the kind of quiet humor that took people time to notice. He went to school in Santa Fe at 16 to learn land management and surveying, because Ada had always pushed for education, and because Louis had always supported whatever the children determined they wanted. And he came back at 19 with skills, and with a settled quality that made Louis feel something he would not have known how to name when he was 29 riding into Redrock Crossing, but knew exactly now. Pride so deep it was almost like love, because it was love. Clara was 17 when her brother came back from Santa Fe, and she was studying on the subject of law, not to be a lawyer, because that was not possible for a woman in 1900, not yet, but because she intended to understand the law thoroughly enough to use it, and she had very specific ideas about property rights and water rights, and the ways in which the territory's legal system had been applied unjustly. And she said so clearly to anyone who would listen, and some who would prefer not to. Louis and Ada listened to her with genuine attention, and with the deep satisfaction of parents who had raised someone who thought for herself. Reverend Holt retired in 1895 and moved east, and a younger minister named Cole came, who was perhaps more progressive than his predecessor, and who found in Ada Wilcox Walker a parishioner of the most honest sort, someone who came to church to be genuinely present rather than to be seen, and who had complicated opinions about grace that were well worth hearing. Louis was less consistently present in the pew and more consistently present in the practice, which Reverend Cole came to understand was its own kind of faith. Old Mr. Garza died in the winter of 1896 peacefully, at a very advanced age, and the whole town mourned him sincerely. Louis and Ada attended the funeral, and Louis said afterward that Garza had been one of the good ones, and they didn't put enough weight on that. Bess, the sorrel mare who had thrown a shoe at the most important moment of her owner's life, lived to be 22 years old and died on a warm May afternoon in 1896, in the paddock with the sun on her back and the grass under her feet, and Louis buried her at the edge of the north field, where the sagebrush grew thick, and the bluffs were visible on clear days, and he said over her grave that she was the best horse he had ever known and the most consequential, and he meant both things entirely. Percy was gray at the Temples by 1898, and Grace had taught herself to read and was extremely pleased about it, and their house in town was full of the particular cheerful noise of a family that was doing well, and this was a source of genuine pleasure to Louis and Ada, who had watched it develop year by year. The boarding house continued to thrive into the new century, though the nature of its guests changed as the territory changed. The railroad had brought development, and development had brought a different quality of traveler. Ada modernized the kitchen in 1901 with a proper cast-iron range that was the finest in the valley, and the meals that came out of it were spoken of with appreciation across a considerable radius. Ellen had married and moved on, and Ruth had taken primary responsibility for the housekeeping side and was excellent at it, and Ada was now more the manager than the do-everything herself, though she had not entirely surrendered doing everything herself. Louis, at 51, was still on the ranch every day. He moved more carefully than he had at 29, but he moved continuously, and the work was in him too deep to want to stop, and besides the land needed tending, and he was the one who tended it. James worked alongside him most days, and there was between them the companionship of two people who share a language about land and animals that does not require many words. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, a January evening in 1904, Ada and Louis sat alone in the parlor after the family dinner had ended, and the children had gone home to their respective lives. James now in his own house on the adjacent property with his wife and their two children, Clara in Santa Fe, where she worked as a legal clerk, and came home for holidays with her particular brightness and her strong opinions. The fire was the same fire they had always built in the parlor. The room was warm and the outside was cold, as it always was in January, and the town beyond the windows was quiet. Ada was 52 and Louis was 55, and they had been married for 25 years, and the evidence of those years was pleasant to count. Louis's dark hair was entirely silver now, and he wore it shorter than he once had, and his face had deepened with weather and years but was genuinely better looking for it, in Ada's estimation, which she had stated on more than one occasion. Ada's auburn silver hair was piled in the way she had always kept it, that upright, contained arrangement that she had first worn when she was 26 and running a boarding house alone, and needed all her competence on the outside of her. She had long since allowed herself the luxury of not needing everything on the outside. They sat together as they had always sat, her with her book and him with his coffee and the fire and the quiet. 25 years, she said. Yes, he said. Do you know what I think about, she said. Tell me, he said. I think about that morning, she said, when I opened the door and you were there. He looked at her across the warm room. I think about that too. You could have come back inside, she said. When you found nothing at the door, you could have gone back to bed. I suppose, he said, but you didn't, she said. No, he said, I didn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's what I knew. Not when you walked in the first night, not even when you drove to the creek with me. I knew it when I opened that door and found you there. A man who sits outside a door all night in the cold because he wants to make sure someone is safe and doesn't say a word about it doesn't need to be thanked for it. I knew then what kind of man you were. Louis Walker looked at his wife, at this woman he had been finding more and more of for 25 years and had never reached the end of, and he said, You changed my life. You changed mine, she said. You gave it direction again. You gave it a home, he said. You gave me a place to be the kind of man I wanted to be. She set down her book. He set down his coffee, and she crossed the parlor to where he was sitting and sat beside him on the wide chair that they had shared since the children were small, and she leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together in the firelight as the January night pressed cold against the windows of the boarding house that was their home and their life, and the best thing either of them had built. Outside, the stars over Redrock Crossing were as bright as they had been on that November night in 1878, when Louis Walker had first looked up at them, and felt something changing in him that he did not yet have words for. The bluffs to the north were dark shapes against the sky, and somewhere on the property 4 miles out, the cattle were sleeping in the field, and the sagebrush was silver in the starlight, and Bess's field was quiet and still, and everything that had been built from that one thrown horseshoe and that one cold door was present and real and continuing. Clara came home for a visit in March of that year, arriving on the midday stage with her traveling case and her strong opinions and her green eyes exactly like her mother's. And she brought news that she had passed a legal examination that was not open to women in most other places, but that Santa Fe, in its particular development of the new century, had allowed, and that she was now a fully credentialed legal advisor capable of practicing independently in the territory. Ada received this news with a particular brand of pride that is almost indistinguishable from joy. Louis shook his daughter's hand and then held her, and she let him, which was more than she usually allowed because Clara Walker was a person of considerable independence and selective softness. I told you, Louis said into the top of her dark hair. You told me what, she said, muffled, that you'd find a way. She pulled back and looked at him with Ada's eyes and her own expression. You and Mother make it difficult not to, she said. James brought his family for Sunday dinner that week. His wife Anna and their 2 boys, Thomas, who was 5, and Robert, who was 3, and named for Ada's first husband as James himself was, because the Walkers were people who carried their history forward without shame. The dinner table was loud and full, and Ada presided over it with the same brisk and generous warmth she had brought to the dining room when it was strangers, and Louis sat at his end and looked at the full length of the table, the people he loved arranged around it in the particular chaos of a family being itself. And he felt, as he had felt for 25 years in various forms and on various occasions, the deep and quiet astonishment of a man who had nearly ridden past the best thing in his life and instead had stopped. The boarding house stood at the corner of the main street of Redrock Crossing in the New Mexico territory and would stand there for many years more, its front kept clean and its sign well painted, and its windows repaired before they could properly fail, because that was how Ada Walker ran things. The ranch north of town grew and kept growing carefully as Louis Walker managed it, and the valley around it was as much their home as it had ever been anything. Louis Walker, who had once been a cowboy moving through the territory with no particular direction and a good horse, and the vague shape of a future he had not yet defined, had found that future in a woman who served 15-cent stew and drove wagons in the cold, and opened her door one November dawn to find a frost-covered man who had spent the night outside it because he loved her before he knew he loved her and was keeping watch anyway. And Ada Wilcox Walker, who had built herself back from grief with her own hands and her own absolute refusal to let anything under her care fall to ruin, had discovered that building alone and building with someone who understood why the thing mattered were different in a way she had not been prepared for, and that the second was larger and better, and worth every risk of opening the door again. They lived, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that life offers, with full hearts and clear eyes and the particular grace of people who chose each other daily and meant it every time. The spring of 1904 came to the valley with its usual extravagance, the sagebrush going silver green, the creek running full, the bluffs burning copper in the late light, and Ada Walker stood at the window of the boarding house kitchen in the morning and watched Louis cross the yard toward the barn with the unhurried, purposeful stride she had known for 25 years. And she felt the warmth of it move through her the way it always had, as though it were new every time, which was the particular miracle of it. She turned back to the stove and the coffee and the morning bread, and the house breathed around her with the familiar sounds of everything that was hers and his and theirs. And outside in the new spring morning, Redrock Crossing was waking up to another day in the long and particular life of itself, and the world was exactly as it should be.